The morning of March 14th, 1853, cut through Southside Virginia like a blade, slicing the familiar order of plantation society clean in two. Before the sun had fully climbed the horizon, whispers began sliding from porch to porch, carried on cold air that smelled of damp earth and tobacco smoke. 23-year-old Katherine Dunmore, the refined eldest daughter of one of the region's wealthiest planters, had vanished from her room as though the night itself had swallowed her, and with her had disappeared Samuel, a 26-year-old enslaved clerk whose name appeared in the plantation ledgers beside a monetary value of $1,200, but whose literacy made him dangerous in ways no one had dared acknowledge aloud. The disappearance alone was enough to send tremors through the county, but it was the secret pulled from beneath the loose floorboards of Katherine's chamber that shattered everything people believed to be true. 47 letters written in Samuel's careful hand. Letters not of kidnapping but of intention, devotion, and an escape so meticulously planned it defied every rule the South held sacred. The authorities who found those letters hesitated only seconds before burying the evidence under layers of secrecy. No respectable household in Mecklenburg County could withstand the scandal these pages implied, and no one was prepared to confront the possibility that a planter's daughter might willingly flee with a man the law considered property. Decision after decision was made behind closed doors, and within hours the narrative was rewritten into something palatable, something safe, something untrue. For 170 years, the truth would remain locked behind courthouse doors, sealed in vaults, whispered only in the trembling confessions of those who had understood too late what they had witnessed. But on that morning in 1853, all anyone knew was that Dunmore Hall, a two-story manor towering above nearly 800 acres, was no longer merely a symbol of wealth and order. It had become a crime scene, a riddle, and the birthplace of a scandal that threatened to crumble an entire community's understanding of loyalty, justice, and forbidden connection. Dunmore Hall itself stood like a monument carved from pride and old Virginia tradition, resting 3 miles beyond the town of Briarford, its brick walls catching the early light as though nothing inside them had changed. Fields of tobacco rolled outward in every direction, tended by 53 enslaved laborers, whose cabins sat in orderly rows just beyond the main house. Colonel Alistair Dunmore, widowed for 6 years and hardened by brief service in the Mexican War, presided over the estate with an almost military precision. To the county, he was the embodiment of Southern respectability, punctual in debt payment, immovable in principle, admired for discipline and order. Katherine had been raised under these carefully stacked expectations, stepping into her mother's role after fever took her at 17, running the kitchen, the gardens, the dairy, and all domestic staff with a quiet authority people praised as maturity. But beneath that composure had lingered something few noticed, a reservedness that made her refusals of marriage proposals seem like quirks rather than warnings. Samuel had arrived 4 years earlier, purchased from a Richmond estate after his former owner, a schoolmaster, died suddenly, leaving debts that consumed every asset, including the people he technically owned. Unlike most enslaved individuals brought to rural Virginia, Samuel carried with him reading, writing, and a manner shaped by academic exposure rather than field labor. The colonel, pragmatic even when controversial, saw value in literacy and bought Samuel specifically to serve as plantation clerk, managing ledgers, transcribing letters, and organizing the bureaucratic machinery that kept Dunmore Hall profitable. This unusual role isolated Samuel from the enslaved community, too privileged for field work, yet too bound to be treated as a free man, and he lived in a liminal space where belonging eluded him from every direction. He ate alone, slept in a cramped room beside the office, and cultivated the habit of silence, observing the world without ever appearing part of it. Virginia, in 1853, enforced its racial boundaries with the weight of law and expectation, every interaction between white and black lives governed by rules older than the families who upheld them. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 cast a long shadow, making northern states hostile terrain for runaways and emboldening slave catchers with federal authority. Conversations between Katherine and Samuel began innocently, strictly within the realm of plantation management, always brief, always within earshot of others. But sometime in the heat of the summer of 1851, those exchanges lengthened, taking detours into literature, a world Samuel knew from the schoolmaster's shelves, and Katherine knew only in fragments from tutors who had never challenged her to think beyond her station. These conversations became the quiet pulse beneath their otherwise rigidly separate lives, a pulse they never acknowledged aloud. By the fall of that same year, Katherine's steps toward the office became more frequent, more intentional, cloaked in excuses about accounts that needed checking or correspondence requiring review. Samuel, always cautious, always aware of the knife edge he lived upon, read to her from books the Colonel never touched, Milton, Shakespeare, histories etched with themes neither of them dared apply to their own lives. Their voices lowered when footsteps approached, their conversations clipped instantly into professional tones. There was no confession, no spoken admission of tension or curiosity or the dangerous bond forming between them. Yet by the spring of 1852, something unspoken began shifting, an awareness that neither could name without risking ruin but could no longer ignore. The questions Katherine posed took on an edge that cut through the fragile decorum they maintained. She asked about Samuel's life before Dunmore Hall, about the political storms gathering in Congress over slavery's expansion, about the world beyond plantations and propriety. Samuel, in his later testimony, would say he answered carefully, never forgetting the stakes, never allowing honesty to slip into recklessness. But the more they spoke, the more Katherine saw him not as property, not as a line in her father's ledger, but as a mind, an equal, perhaps even a mirror, reflecting truths she had been trained never to acknowledge. By the end of that summer, the impossible had already begun forming roots stronger than anything either of them fully understood. By August of 1852, the boundary between duty and longing had thinned into something fragile, something that might shatter at a single careless word. Their conversations, once harmless exchanges about ledgers, now contained layers no observer could decode. Hidden inside their discussions of harvest schedules and correspondence deadlines were questions of ethics, hope, fear, and the faintest glimmer of something far more dangerous than affection. Neither intended for the evolution to happen, neither could stop it once it began. And though Katherine outwardly remained the composed daughter of a respected Virginia colonel, her quiet steps toward the office in evening hours revealed an internal battle she could no longer deny. Samuel, for his part, walked with the posture of a man who feared every breath might be overheard, every glance misinterpreted, every truth punished with a finality that left no room for forgiveness. By late autumn, they had formed a hidden method of communication, notes tucked beneath account sheets, questions written in coded language only they understood, thoughts too delicate or too dangerous to speak aloud. And as winter descended, they began planning something unthinkable in the rigid world of the antebellum South, the kind of plan whispered only in abolitionist networks hundreds of miles away. At first, the idea formed hesitantly, like fog creeping across low ground. But soon it took shape, flight northward, abandoning everything Katherine had ever known, everything Samuel had ever been forced to endure. The plan would require precision, secrecy, and a degree of trust that defied every law and every social truth hammered into them since birth. Yet the alternative, remaining, was becoming unbearable. For Samuel, staying meant continuing life as a ledger entry, a tool used until broken. For Katherine, staying meant choking on the knowledge that her silence upheld the very system that denied Samuel's humanity. Through the long winter nights of 1852, Samuel mapped out the routes north using the plantation's old surveying documents, memorizing rivers, abandoned mills, and footpaths rarely used except by hunters. He tracked the movements of slave catchers in nearby counties, studied their patterns, learned which towns harbored sympathizers and which were infested with bounty hunters. Katherine contributed equally vital knowledge, the rhythm of the household, the timing of her father's business trips, the guard rotations, the idiosyncrasies of every locked door within the estate. Her room became a quiet sanctuary where she stitched travel garments, sewing them into a trunk she claimed held winter clothes bound for family in Tennessee. The deception was subtle, carefully woven into the routines of plantation life, and beneath the floorboards of her room, like artifacts of a forbidden world, collected their letters, 47 by the time March arrived. Each letter was a piece of their shared resolve, written in coded phrases that would seem innocent or meaningless to anyone else. They spoke of journeys of the heart, meaning the escape route, Storms beyond the horizon, meaning patrols or slave catchers. Winter grains sealed in the chest, meaning money and provisions. And threaded between these coded logistics were truths neither dared to articulate plainly. Truths of devotion, fear, tenderness, and the fragile hope that a world existed somewhere beyond the reach of Virginia's laws. Their plan matured into a living thing, complete with contingencies and rehearsals. They synchronized their pocket watches weeks in advance. They agreed on signals, 3 knocks on the kitchen wall, the movement of a candle in an upstairs window. And all the while, Dunmore Hall continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the quiet storm building at its center. On March 13, 1853, the moonless sky descended like a curtain over the estate. Colonel Dunmore departed for Richmond that morning with his manservant, unaware that his absence marked the final threshold of a plan 15 months in the making. Katherine retired early, still dressed beneath her nightgown, her packed trunk positioned discreetly behind the wardrobe. Samuel completed his tasks in the office, banking the fire, organizing the colonel's correspondence, and ensuring nothing appeared out of place. To any observer, the evening was routine, nothing unusual, nothing amiss. But inside both of them churned a terror sharpened by the certainty that if caught, Samuel would die violently, and Katherine's fate would be far worse than exile. Sometime before midnight, Samuel moved silently through the darkened house, guided by memory rather than sight. He slipped into the study and used the copied key he had crafted months earlier to open the safe. Inside, stacks of paper currency and gold glimmered in the faint light, far more than they needed. Samuel took only what was required for their journey, leaving the rest untouched to delay discovery. Katherine descended the servants' staircase, avoiding the main steps whose third board creaked loudly enough to wake Mrs. Hawthorne. They met in the summer kitchen, the night air cold against their trembling hands. A small wagon Samuel had prepared earlier waited beneath the shadows, loaded with supplies hidden under a canvas tarp. And with one final glance toward the home that had shaped and confined them both, they stepped into the darkness together. By dawn, they were miles from Dunmore Hall, following narrow deer paths and creek beds to avoid any traceable footprints. They abandoned the wagon, concealed their tracks with branches, and continued on foot, skirting familiar roads with an instinct for survival neither had been trained for but both possessed intuitively. And back at the plantation, as morning light seeped into Katherine's untouched bed and Samuel's neatly arranged desk, the first ripples of panic began forming. Mrs. Hawthorne knocked at Katherine's door at 7, found it empty, and felt a chill settle into her bones. Moments later, the overseer discovered Samuel's room vacant, his personal belongings untouched. The alarm spread quickly, voices rising, horses saddled, riders dispatched, but none of them could imagine the greater horror they were about to uncover. The loose floorboard beneath Katherine's bedside table waited like a trap-door into truth. When Taggart discovered the hidden letters, neatly folded beneath the ledger's false bottom, his face twisted first in confusion, then revulsion. He had found the unthinkable. Not a kidnapping, but collaboration. Not coercion, but choice. And in the rigid moral universe of 1853 Virginia, nothing was more terrifying than the suggestion that a planter's daughter had willingly planned her own escape with a man the law defined as property. Magistrate Aldridge Howell, summoned to the scene, read only a handful of the letters before his hands began to tremble. Their language, coded yet unmistakable, told a truth no white official in the county could afford to acknowledge. The scandal threatened everything: social order, reputation, the fragile hierarchy that maintained plantation society. With a voice barely steady, Howell ordered the letters sealed, their contents declared forged, their implications buried beneath an official narrative of abduction. As search parties swarmed Dunmore Hall and Colonel Dunmore raced home in fury and grief, the truth lived only in those hidden pages and in the footsteps of 2 fugitives moving north under the ghostly cover of trees. But even they did not know that their carefully guarded secret was only one thread of a much larger tapestry, one that would unravel in ways neither could foresee. Colonel Dunmore returned to his estate on the evening of March 15th, his carriage thundering up the long drive, lanterns swinging wildly in the driver's grip as if the darkness itself were pursuing them. The manor was ablaze with activity, horses stamping, men shouting, torches flickering against brick walls that had never seen such chaos. When Taggart delivered his twisted version of events, presenting Samuel as a kidnapper and Katherine as a helpless victim, the colonel listened with a stillness that frightened everyone present. Only when he demanded to see the letters did the mask crack. He read each page in silence, his jaw tightening with every line, his face drained of color, until finally he snapped the final letter shut and said only one word: "Burn." Magistrate Howell hesitated, not from moral courage, but from a sense of history pressing upon him. He made copies of the letters before sealing the originals in the courthouse vault, a decision he would agonize over for the rest of his life. The official story spread quickly. Samuel, a dangerous, educated slave, had abducted Colonel Dunmore's daughter and fled north, likely to sell her to abolitionists eager for propaganda. The narrative was convenient, contained, something respectable families could repeat without confronting the cracks in their own fragile truths. But the reward posters told another story. $1,000 for information leading to Katherine's safe recovery, and $500 for Samuel, dead or alive, figures so inflated they betrayed desperation and a truth no one dared admit aloud. Meanwhile, Katherine and Samuel were already crossing into North Carolina, moving through marshes and dense woods with an instinctive caution sharpened by fear. They traveled at night, slept in thickets or abandoned barns during the day, relying on whispered networks Samuel had researched for months. Quaker families left lanterns burning in specific windows as signals. Free black communities offered hidden cellars and meals without questions. And scattered across the hills were nameless farmers who shared their bread not out of politics, but out of a quiet human decency stronger than the law. But every safe house carried risk. Slave catchers roamed the border with rifles and dogs, lured by Dunmore's reward, and each time a twig snapped in the dark, Katherine felt the cold certainty that they might not survive the next mile. Back at Dunmore Hall, the illusion that this was merely a kidnapping evaporated 3 days later when Mrs. Hawthorne discovered something no official search had imagined. While cleaning Katherine's room in a desperate attempt to restore order to the chaos, she noticed a loose floorboard beneath the bedside table. Beneath it rested a small wooden box she had never seen before, tucked with the care of someone hiding their soul. Inside was a meticulously wrapped daguerreotype. Samuel's face preserved in silver, his gaze steady and contemplative, captured by a photographer who must have risked everything to take it. No white photographer in the county would have agreed to such a portrait unless bribed into secrecy. Next to the image lay a simple gold ring, a woman's ring, and beneath it, an unfinished letter written in Katherine's delicate hand. Mrs. Hawthorne read the first line and staggered backward as though struck. "Dearest Samuel, by the time you read this, our fate will already be sealed." And then the sentence that froze her blood: "The child I carry is yours." She dropped the letter as if it had burned her fingers. The one truth Plantation society refused to face, the truth more feared than murder, more scandalous than betrayal, was now undeniable. Katherine was carrying Samuel's child, and that meant everything the county believed about order, purity, hierarchy, and race had been obliterated by a love they refused to name. The overseer delivered the box to Magistrate Howell with trembling hands. Howell read the unfinished letter once, then twice, then sealed it without a word. He recorded privately that it was the most devastating document he had ever held. Then he took it to Colonel Dunmore, knowing the revelation might destroy him. What happened in that private meeting became the subject of whispered rumor for generations. Some said Colonel Dunmore collapsed into tears. Others said he raged, overturning furniture and swearing vengeance against abolitionists, Samuel, and God himself. But those who knew the colonel best knew the truth was simpler, colder. He stared at the items for a long time, his grief transforming into something heavy and impenetrable. Then he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He dismissed every search party at once. He cancelled all rewards. He sent word across 3 states that the pursuit was over. Then he announced 2 lies so deftly crafted they silenced the county. He declared his daughter dead, claimed she had succumbed to fever in a remote settlement, and he announced that Samuel had been found shot in the mountains while resisting capture. Both statements were false, but they achieved exactly what the colonel intended. They protected the reputation of his family, and they sealed the truth behind walls no one would dare breach. Dunmore Hall attempted to settle back into its routines, but silence haunted every corner of the estate. Rooms once filled with Katherine's presence remained closed, their curtains drawn as though in mourning. Mrs. Hawthorne prayed over her rosary until the beads wore smooth. The enslaved community, far more perceptive than anyone credited them for, exchanged quiet whispers of both admiration and fear. Samuel had been an outsider among them, but he had also helped many read letters, write petitions, and understand contracts. His flight with Katherine was seen not as betrayal, but as a glimpse of a kind of freedom most dared not imagine. Yet they knew that her absence would bring consequences to them long before they reached her. Rumors filtered back through networks that crisscrossed the South like invisible vines. A couple matching Katherine and Samuel's description had reached Maryland. A woman traveling under the name Mrs. Carter had given birth in Philadelphia. An educated black man had died of fever mere weeks later in a boarding house crowded with refugees and fugitives. The stories traveled by whispers, coded songs, and scraps of letters smuggled from one community to another. They reached the enslaved people of Dunmore Hall long before they reached Colonel Dunmore, who remained locked in his study, nursing grief and rage in equal measure. But forces beyond Virginia were already moving. In September 1853, in the abolitionist stronghold of Ripley, Ohio, Reverend Jonas Rankin received a letter from Philadelphia that would change everything. Signed under a false name, it requested help contacting a Virginia family regarding an inheritance matter. Rankin, suspicious, ignored it, but the second letter stripped away all doubt. It mentioned Colonel Alistair Dunmore by name. And when the third letter arrived, a 9-page testimony written in trembling script by Katherine herself, Rankin understood he had stepped into the center of a tragedy far larger than he expected. Katherine revealed everything except the pregnancy she feared to expose. She described their escape, Samuel's death from typhoid, and her newborn daughter, whom she named Clara. And then she made her plea, not for herself but for the child. She asked whether her father might consider acknowledging his granddaughter, even if he refused to acknowledge her. Rankin sent the inquiry to Magistrate Howell, hoping for mercy. But mercy was not a currency Dunmore traded in. He refused outright, declaring he had no daughter and no descendants, then threatened legal action if the woman in Philadelphia continued to use his family name. Katherine's reply was heartbreakingly brief. She wrote, "I knew when I fled that I was choosing death to the life I once knew. My daughter is free, and that must be enough." And in abolitionist newspapers across the North, her words ignited both admiration and outrage. But even then, even in her grief, her isolation, her new life carved from ashes, Katherine did not yet know that she and Samuel had not been acting alone, that their escape had been the surface of something deeper, that beneath Dunmore Hall's orderly routines had existed a shadow network, gathering evidence, recording secrets, and risking everything to expose a crime far more expansive than two lovers fleeing into the night. And the next revelation would come not from the North, nor from Katherine's letters, but from an envelope forgotten inside Samuel's Bible. A letter that began with the words, "Your inquiry is noted," and nothing written in its careful hand was what anyone believed. The forgotten letter tucked inside Samuel's Bible, folded so small it nearly blended into the seam, rewrote everything the officials believed they understood. Magistrate Howell examined it with unease, noting the unfamiliar handwriting and the chilling ambiguity of its message. "Your inquiry is noted. The arrangement can proceed once timing and route are confirmed. Burn this upon receipt." There was no name, no signature, no location. Only the unmistakable implication that Samuel had been communicating with someone outside the plantation months before the escape. This was no spontaneous act of passion or desperation. It hinted at coordination, intelligence work, and a broader resistance network operating silently beneath Virginia's polished veneer of order. Colonel Dunmore seized upon the letter as a lifeline, proof, he insisted, that abolitionist agents had manipulated his daughter and ensnared his plantation in their schemes. Howell allowed the colonel to cling to that fragile comfort, even as doubt gnawed at him. He had read Katherine's unfinished letter. He had seen the daguerreotype, the ring, the tenderness that no coercion could counterfeit. But the truth reached far beyond forbidden affection. In Philadelphia, Katherine struggled through her first winter alone, surviving by sewing intricate garments for wealthy clients who never asked why her eyes carried such quiet sorrow. Yet it was an unexpected visitor, Reverend Theodore Jenkins, who would unravel the next knot in this tangled story. A well-dressed black minister with gentle eyes and an air of purposeful calm, Jenkins introduced himself as a friend of Samuel's. He spoke with compassion about Samuel's final days, then asked questions with surgical precision, questions about correspondence, plantation records, and specific names Katherine barely remembered hearing. At first, she mistook his curiosity for pastoral concern. But when he returned weeks later, Katherine felt the shift, a solemn urgency beneath his polite exterior. And when he finally revealed the truth, it struck her with the force of a blow. Samuel had not been a simple runaway dreaming of freedom. He had been quietly recruited by abolitionist operatives in 1851 after rumors emerged of an illegal slave-exporting ring stretching from Virginia to Cuba and Brazil, a network that disguised its operations through legitimate plantation records and maritime contracts. A network powerful enough to erase evidence, silence witnesses, and bend law to its will. The key to exposing this ring lay in documentation. Letters, ledgers, and coded exchanges hidden in the everyday business of plantations like Dunmore Hall. Samuel, educated and placed at the heart of the colonel's operations, was in a position no other enslaved man could occupy. Jenkins explained that Samuel agreed to gather evidence long before Katherine became part of his life. He intended to flee alone at first, Jenkins said gently. But when he learned you were carrying his child, everything changed. His plans, his timing, even his caution. Katherine felt the room tilt as she absorbed the truth. For months, Samuel had copied incriminating correspondence, preserving evidence of a criminal empire reaching far beyond any single plantation. But when Katherine insisted on joining him in the escape, he chose love over mission, altering a plan that had taken years to build. Jenkins assured her Samuel's feelings had been real, intense, protective, unwavering, but the revelation left Katherine torn between heartbreak and admiration. Without hesitation, though, she told Jenkins to publish the evidence. If Samuel died for the truth, then the truth must live. And so in 1859, abolitionist newspapers erupted with scandal as documents traced illegal slave shipments to prominent Virginia families, igniting political fury across the South. Colonels, bankers, shipping firms, men who had claimed Christian morality and Southern honor were exposed as traffickers in human lives. Their profits, the articles revealed, funded pro-slavery propaganda and political campaigns. Dunmore Hall was not immune to disgrace. Though the evidence against Colonel Dunmore was ambiguous, suggesting he may have been unknowingly drawn into the network through legitimate business partners, the stain on his name grew darker. His nephew sold the estate and fled the county. Former neighbors stopped speaking his name. And Howell, shaken to his core, reread every letter he had hidden years earlier, realizing that Katherine and Samuel had stood at the crossroads of a larger war he barely understood. But the final blow had yet to fall. Because years after Katherine stabilized her life in Boston, where she taught music and raised Clara, another visitor arrived. A historian named William Crenshaw, whose polite smile masked a relentless hunger for answers. He believed Samuel had not acted alone inside Dunmore Hall. He believed someone remained behind after their escape, someone who continued gathering evidence until Colonel Dunmore's death. Crenshaw pressed Katherine for memories, conversations, gestures, names spoken in passing, but she remembered nothing that solved the riddle. Yet his persistence planted a seed of unease she could not shake. Who had helped Samuel identify which letters to copy? Who had advised him where to look? Who had risked their life to remain in the belly of the beast after he escaped? The answer arrived unexpectedly 2 years later when refugees from Virginia reached Boston after the Emancipation Proclamation. Among them was Ruth, a middle-aged woman who had worked in Dunmore Hall's kitchen, a woman whose presence pulled Katherine back into memories she had spent years trying to contain. They exchanged pleasantries at first, but days later, Ruth appeared at Katherine's door alone, trembling but determined. And when she finally spoke, history shifted once more. "I was his partner," Ruth whispered. "Samuel didn't run from the plantation. Samuel ran with the evidence I helped him gather." Katherine felt her breath stop. Ruth explained how she had been born free in Delaware, Kidnapped into slavery at 15 and forced south, yet she never relinquished her literacy, her sharp mind, or her will to resist. She had spent 13 years studying Dunmore Hall from within, gathering knowledge, forming quiet alliances, waiting for the right person to arrive. When Samuel was purchased, she saw at once what he was: educated, perceptive, positioned where he could read the Colonel's correspondence. For a year she watched him discreetly, confirming his distrust of the system and his hunger for freedom. Then she approached him with a proposition: gather evidence, not simply for himself, but for everyone trapped in the machinery of bondage. Together they created an invisible network. Ruth listened, observed, memorized names. Samuel copied letters at night, slid coded messages into hidden seams of the plantation's landscape. They built an archive of resistance under the Colonel's nose. A hidden war fought not with weapons, but with documents, proof that could someday shatter the empire that enslaved them. When Katherine entered Samuel's life, Ruth warned him the connection was dangerous, but love is a force that defies strategy. And once Katherine became pregnant, Samuel refused to leave her behind. "So I helped," Ruth said quietly. "I made sure the night watchman took the long route. I made sure the dogs were calm. I made sure no one saw you leave." Katherine's hands shook as she listened, realizing that her escape, once imagined as a daring act of love, had been made possible by a woman history nearly erased. But Ruth had stayed behind, continued the mission, gathered evidence for years after Samuel fled. Working inside a world that had stolen her freedom, she turned knowledge into a weapon sharper than any blade. And somewhere beneath Dunmore Hall, in a cellar barrel Samuel once mentioned, remained the last documents she could not smuggle out. The final pieces of a puzzle no one alive yet fully understood. Ruth's confession reshaped everything Katherine believed she understood about her past. The escape she once imagined as a desperate act fueled by forbidden love was, in truth, only one branch of a far larger resistance, one orchestrated by people whose names would never appear in history books. Ruth described in calm, unwavering detail how she had gathered information for years while pretending to be nothing more than a kitchen servant. She memorized overheard conversations, hidden business dealings, the names of traders who traveled through the region, and the coded signals passed quietly between slave buyers and shipping agents. Samuel became the voice of the documents, but Ruth was the architect. "I could not run," she said softly, "but I could fight." And she had fought with every scrap of knowledge she possessed, even as the world assumed she was powerless. Katherine listened with a mixture of awe and grief as Ruth revealed how deeply the network had infiltrated Dunmore Hall. They had informants among field workers, free black sailors in Norfolk, Quakers in Maryland, and even a few reluctant white laborers who had witnessed too much cruelty to remain silent. Samuel was only the courier. Ruth had been the strategist, the one who understood that the most dangerous weapon in a slaveholding society was information. Her work continued even after Katherine and Samuel fled north. Under the Colonel's nose, through months of rising suspicion, she gathered enough evidence to expose an international trafficking pipeline hiding behind the guise of legitimate plantation business. But as she finished her story, her voice grew faint. Illness had already hollowed her frame, and she admitted she had only months left. "I needed someone to know," she whispered. "Someone who loved Samuel should know the truth." Katherine held her as she wept, feeling the weight of a legacy she never knew she was part of. When Ruth died in February 1864, Katherine arranged a funeral attended by dozens of formerly enslaved people who had traveled north during the war. They sang hymns Ruth had taught them in whispers behind the plantation kitchens. They spoke of her courage, her cunning, her unyielding refusal to be broken. It was only then that Katherine realized the full scope of the resistance around her. A world of hidden rebels, of silent warriors, of people who had survived by blending into the very system they intended to destroy. While the nation tore itself apart in open conflict, there had been another war beneath the surface, fought with pens and memory, scraps of paper and stolen knowledge. Samuel and Ruth had risked everything for a truth most Americans were not ready to face. And Katherine understood that preserving their legacy was now her responsibility. After the Civil War ended, Katherine returned briefly to Virginia, not out of nostalgia, but to confront the ruins of the world that had shaped her. Dunmore Hall stood partially burned, its grandeur reduced to charred beams and crumbling brick. Union officers had used the estate as headquarters, stripping it of most valuables, yet the cellar remained intact. And in the northernmost barrel, beneath a false wooden bottom exactly where Samuel had said it would be, Katherine found the documents Ruth had referenced, ledgers, letters, maps, and drafts of contracts tied to illegal slave shipments bound for foreign ports. Though the war had ended slavery, the evidence exposed a truth the nation had not yet reckoned with. Trafficking had not simply been a southern sin, but a global enterprise intertwined with banks, governments, shipping empires, and respectable men who walked freely in polished boots. Katherine delivered the documents to abolitionist leaders who used them in post-war tribunals. Names were exposed, fortunes were seized, and reputations shattered. For the first time, the world glimpsed the hidden machinery Ruth and Samuel had dedicated their lives to dismantling. But even as justice reached some of the guilty, Katherine carried a sorrow that justice could never erase. Samuel would never see the world he helped shape. Ruth would never witness the freedom she fought for. Her father died clinging to pride, unable to accept truth until his final breath. And she herself lived suspended between two worlds, neither the sheltered daughter of Dunmore Hall nor the radical abolitionist many believed her to be. But in the quiet moments, watching her daughter Clara learn to read, Katherine felt a peace she had never known in Virginia. Her child belonged to no one. Her future was not pre-written. Over the years, Katherine carefully organized every letter, testimony, journal, and document connected to the story. She ensured that Ruth's name was written boldly at the center of the archive, not as a servant, but as a strategist, a resistor, a mind sharper than any overseer ever suspected. She preserved Samuel's letters, including the final one discovered in the wall during the 1914 renovation, a letter addressed not to her, but to Ruth. "You were the courage I needed when my own courage failed. You gave me purpose beyond survival." He explained how he had first been contacted by abolitionist scouts, how Ruth had convinced him to join the network, and how falling in love with Katherine had changed everything. "I leave tonight," he wrote, "not as a man escaping bondage, but as a man carrying the truth we built together." Reading it decades later, historians finally understood the full partnership, the mutual bravery that had escaped public recognition for generations. By the time Katherine died in 1891, pneumonia claiming her quietly in her Boston home, the world had already begun transforming. Clara, now grown, taught history in a school where her mother's past was no longer ashamed to be hidden. The documents Katherine saved entered academic archives, where scholars puzzled over the intricate resistance network operating beneath southern plantations. Ruth's testimony appeared in textbooks. Samuel's letters were studied as rare examples of enslaved literacy and political awareness. And Colonel Dunmore's unsent apology revealed the silent torment of a man trapped between love, pride, and a system that demanded cruelty. Their stories, once buried by fear, protected by lies, and whispered only in secrecy, slowly emerged into the light. Yet the truest legacy was not in the documents, but in the questions their story posed to future generations. What acts of love are worth risking everything? What systems collapse when ordinary people refuse to play their assigned roles? Who are the heroes history forgets because their brilliance was forged in shadows rather than battlefields? Samuel and Katherine did not set out to change a nation. They simply followed each other into the unknown. Ruth never sought glory, only justice in a world that denied her humanity. Together, their choices shaped a truth larger than any single life. And in the end, their courage reminds us that some revolutions begin in whispered conversations, in hidden letters, in the quiet steps of two people walking toward freedom through the dark. Their story is not just history, it is a mirror. And the question now passes to you. What would you risk for love? What would you dare for justice?